In September 1939, war was declared and Britain became involved. Many of the railways in Great Britain suffered from bombing, air raids and the mass migration of evacuees to the west coast, known as Operation Pied Piper. Traffic on the railways was severely restricted. Domestic passenger trains were delayed or even cancelled as lines were damaged to make way for more important goods trains delivering essentials and military equipment. Many locomotives, especially the express locomotives, were stripped of various parts to reduce maintenance costs and often ran on low quality coal, affecting their performance. There were also restrictions in place for constructing locomotives as well. Functionality mattered more than appearance. Many of the freight designs built during the Second World War were built to austere conditions and were very basic in design. A good example is the Southern Railway's Q1 class 060 tender engine designed by Oliver Bulleid, introduced in 1942. These locomotives had a very ugly appearance, with an unusual shaped boiler which won them the name coffee pots, no running plates above the wheels and the most basic features in the cab. They were, however, the most powerful locomotive of the 060 wheel arrangement and were lightweight, being capable of working smaller, more secondary routes. They nearly survived until the bitter end, the last being withdrawn in 1966, and one, numbered C1, is now preserved as part of the National Collection. Some designs of locomotive were built in Britain and other countries and exported for use elsewhere. This was not the first time that it had been the case. In the First World War, the Great Central Railway's 04 Class 280 of 1911 and the Great Western Railway's Churchwood 260 Moguls of the same year had been used by the Railway Operating Division of the Royal Engineers in continental Europe. William Stanier's 8Fs, built originally for the London, Midland and Scottish in 1935, were being built in their hundreds during World War II, being built not just at the LMS's workshops at Crewe and Horwich, but also at Doncaster, Darlington, Eastleigh, Swindon and various other places. They were exported much further afield, to Turkey, the Middle East and Egypt. However, a cheaper design than that was needed as the government's standard design of freight locomotive, as there was a lack of material and manpower. The Ministry of Supply looked towards Robert A. Riddles, their Director of Transportation Equipment since the outbreak of the war, for a new design of locomotive similar to the 8Fs that took into account the shortages in place during this period. The locomotives were known as Austerities due to the cutbacks their designs took into account. 935 were built in total by various workshops throughout the year of 1943, along with a larger 210 development introduced the same year. These locomotives, however, were very unpopular, especially with crews. They were very rough riding as the tenders quite often rattle about in motion. Riddles himself said that he didn't care if they were dumped into the sea as soon as the war was over. Although they lasted well after their intended lifespan, 733 of the 280s and 25 of the 210s went into service with British Railways. Others seeing service overseas, and they were loathed so much that none of the British Railway locomotives were preserved. An American version of this design, the US Army's S-160 class 280, also saw brief service in Britain, but all were exported after D-Day as they often failed with insufficient braking equipment, and 3 suffered with collapsed fire crowns, one incident killing the driver. However, 15 of the smaller S100 060 tank locomotives saw service on the Southern Railway after the war, shunting at Southampton docks, where they survived until the end of Southern Steam in 1967. One design which was more popular than Riddle's heavy freight locomotives was the Unsplit Engineering Company's Austerity 060 saddle tank. The War Department had originally chosen the LMS Ginty 060 side tank locomotives designed by Henry Fowler in the mid-1920s. However, Unsplit persuaded them that their much simpler design would be more suited. The first was built by their works in Leeds in 1943, and various other firms across the country started building engines to the same design soon after. By 1947, after the war had finished, 377 had been built for the War Department. Most of the locomotives used overseas worked much closer to home than Stannier's 8Fs, being used mainly in France, Belgium and Holland.